All right, we'll go ahead and call our workshop to order and declare a quorum of 6 trustees present. We'll head to item C, public comment. Ms. Horn, do we have any? No public comment. Okay, so we will head to our workshop session. D1, consideration and discussion regarding the 2021 through 2020 or 2022 school calendar. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent. Board members, we have Dr. Trammell here with us this evening to share with us all things associated with calendar development. From the development process, what she shared with DEIC last week, the voting survey results, etc. While this is a discussion-only item at this point in time, it will be an action item at the regular meeting later this evening. Dr. Trammell.
All right, thank you. We come this evening to share a report on the recommendation for the 2021 calendar from the District Education Improvement Council. Just a quick review of the steps in the calendar adoption. In October, the DEIC members received an overview of the calendar process, and they also received a link in order to give input into the 2021 calendar. They were encouraged, I'm going to get this off. They were encouraged to solicit input from their colleagues on their campus as well. Based on that input, 3 calendars were created, and at the November meeting, the DEIC reviewed 3 potential calendars for the 2021 year. They voted to carry forward calendars A and B for community input on the district website. A report was given to the Board of Trustees at the November workshop on these 2 calendar options. The calendars were posted on the CSISD website in December for input. That input was analyzed in January when we got back from break. DEIC members considered the input and voted to put forth the recommendation for calendar A as the calendar for the 2021-22 school year. Tonight, we are bringing the results of the community input to you, and then we'll come to you at the regular board meeting for approval of calendar A for the 2021 school year. When we look at who voted on the calendar, our responses were 2,893. A reminder that some of those could have been parents and teachers. Some of that could have been twice. So if you add the numbers in the column on the right, you're going to get 3,000 something. That's because some people are parents and teachers, or school staff and parent. When we look at who voted, we had 2,147 parents, 528 teachers, 274 other school staff members. We had 40 students who voted, and then we had 22 community members who do not have kids in CSISD schools. Breaking that down, you can see we've looked at it by level: elementary, intermediate, middle, and high school. When we look at our parent group, we had 64% of the parents who voted for option A or calendar A, while around 33 or 34% voted for calendar B. As we look at the different levels within the school system, those percentages held fairly true. About 2/3 of the parents voted for calendar A, around 1/3 voted for calendar B. When we look at our teacher group, very similar results. A little bit of an outlier when we look at middle school, with 70% of the teachers voting for calendar A and 29% or 30% voting for calendar B. And then at our high school level, with 60% of the teachers voting for calendar A and 41-ish% voting for calendar B. As we look at our other
Penny,
schools.
quick question.
Sure.
On the note, will you go back on no response? Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So no response means they opened the survey, but they didn't vote. So maybe they opened it and got distracted, by something else and forgot to come back to it. They intended to vote, but they didn't actually select a calendar choice.
Well, the teachers seem much more focused than the parents.
Yes, the teachers 100% voted for a choice A or B. Absolutely. As we look at other staff members, we had 274 that voted. Around 69% voted for calendar A, and around 30% voted for calendar B. Of the 40 students who voted, 19 voted for A and 16 voted for B, which broke out into around 48% for A and around 40% for B. And again, we had the no response, which was around 13%. Our community members that voted 72% for calendar A and around 23% for calendar B. When we look at our total overall responses, we had for option A 1,815 responses, which equates to around 63% of the public wanted option A. 935 votes for option B, which equated to around 32%, and a decent number of no responses, and I'm assuming they got distracted. 143 individuals opened the poll but never actually selected a calendar. So as we look at the comments, we only had 234 comments this year out of all of the votes that were cast. Around 6% of those comments were around the long winter break. We had 7 people who liked it, 7 people who wanted a shorter winter break. Around 20% of the comments were about Thanksgiving. 38% wanted a full week off with no comp days, just a solid week off. About 8 people wanted a shorter Thanksgiving break. 4% of the people said just let the teachers pick the calendar. 12% really liked the February professional development days, with 23 liking that Friday and Monday sandwich for professional learning, and 6 people not liking that at all. 6% of the people said, you know what, there's really no differences much between these two calendars. 5% of the people put NA. We had 4 people say we would like a 4-day weekend at Easter. And then the rest of the comments were really, and I have them here if anyone wants to take a look at them later. I just picked one. It really doesn't matter. They actually need to be attending year-round school. We prefer less summer and more breaks during the year, things like that. So the other comments were just all over the place and really were miscellaneous and didn't fit in any specific category. So as DEIC considered the input from the community and the number of votes that calendar A received, they voted unanimously to send calendar A forward to the Board of Trustees for approval. And that would be the calendar that we will bring to you tonight at the regular board meeting, in hopes that you would adopt that calendar for our 21-22 school year. I've included a hard copy of that calendar in your board packet on your desk, should you want to take a look at that. And at this time, I would entertain any questions that the board might have about the calendar recommended forward.
I have a question. Obviously, it seems pretty obvious that the teachers and the parents are pretty much in line, and that's nice to see. But I was surprised to see the students where they fell. And honestly, I was having the question before I even saw their response. I was thinking, do we purposefully send this to all the students like we do to parents? Do we?
I believe we just posted on our website.
So that's why I kind of thought when the low number of 40, they have to purposely go out and find it to answer the survey. So I was thinking about maybe considering, especially for high school students.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested to learn about what their wishes are, what's important to them, and particularly in this case, why they kind of were very different, had a very different response than our parents and teachers. At least I'd like to hear it. I'm not saying that's what we should follow, but it would be interesting to hear.
Absolutely. That is definitely something that we can take into consideration for the future. We just posted on our website, and, that's kind of been the tradition for years and years and years. But we do send it, to parents, and so that is a great point.
You happen to be able to see if any of the comments were specifically from students? Are you able to
No.
delineate those?
Actually, no. There was one person that put their name, but I believe it was a parent, so.
Thank you. Thanks for going through the whole process
Sure.
very clearly and describing all the data.
Oh,
Thank you.
You are welcome. Any other questions? Thank you. All right.
See you in about an hour
All right. Thank you.
or so.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
you are welcome.
All right, and that will take us to item D2, consideration and discussion regarding MAP growth assessments. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent, board members. Ms. Perry is going to give us a presentation regarding our MAP instrument. I believe it's Molly, been has it been a year?
October 19th, so a little over a year.
October. So, and we purchased this, our first year to actually have MAP was last year. So we got the beginning of the year administration, mid-year. Obviously, was not able to collect data for end of year. So we're starting the process over, hoping to get a complete year of data using this instrument this year. So Molly's kind of going to give a brief overview and share some data we've collected thus far with MAP this year.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Martindale. Good evening. Mr. Nugent, members of the board, as Mr. Martindale so nicely teed up for me, it has been some time since we discussed at the board level specifics around our MAP assessment. Part of that, a great part of that is due to the impact of COVID and our inability to complete that full cycle during our first year of implementation in the 1920 school year. And so that understanding is going to be important as we go through the data, because it would be most ideal for us to really look at that growth over an entire school year for one cohort. But we are going to look at what MAP is and why we're using it, and then really delve a little bit into that district level data and ultimately focus on how we're using that information in reporting at the campus level to help inform our instruction. So with that, as a reminder for those of you who were with us back in October of 19 when we first really looked at this as a board, this is a computer-based adaptive assessment that is very, very different than many other assessments that our students take, most notably the assessments in which we are measured heavily, such as STAR. So this computer-based assessment is given on an individual device for our older students. That is generally a laptop or in a computer lab. Many of our younger students will take it on an iPad. It is very versatile in that way. But what that means in terms of adaptive is the students' level of difficulty on their questions will increase or decrease depending on the accuracy of their response. And so it's really able to give us a much more comprehensive idea of where a student falls. So we're not giving them the 5th grade test or the 3rd grade test. They are given a range. So say grades 2 through 5, it would adapt up or down within those levels and really be able to more specifically pinpoint where a student is falling. So the purpose really helps us to not only identify where that student is, but to target their instruction and make really well-informed decisions along the way. Because it is administered 3 times a year, we're able to get that information back and really adjust quickly rather than have an end-of-year post-mortem assessment where, okay, now we know how students did, but they've moved on oftentimes to other campuses and not really have an opportunity to respond and have the kind of information that we would desire. MAP really, as we made the selection and decision to move in this direction, was heavily driven not only by our desire to know how our students are doing academically and how they're progressing, but also to inform our community-based accountability system. And as you all know, in the adopted House Bill 3 board goals, it is being used as a progress monitoring measure as well. So why MAP? I think I've talked it up a little bit already, but some other things that are really important components to be aware of as we journey down this discovery of how things are going with it this evening is that it really allows us to personalize instruction. The kinds of reports that I will share with you this evening will really illustrate that this is for all learners, whether you are struggling, whether you're right on target, or whether you're advanced. We're going to better be able to design design those instructional decision-making processes and tailor to individual needs. It does have a goal-setting component, and we'll look at how those norms work for not only your performance in the moment, but also the performance that is projected in terms of growth. And so our students and even parents can see on those family reports what we should consider to be an adequate goal for a student over time and across administrations, which is a great part of that progress monitoring component. For our administrators, this is so much more comprehensive than anything that we have ever done. We've done benchmarks, we've done, individualized assessments, but this is truly a very broad measure that gives us information about students' specific skills, both above and below grade level. And because of the norming components, really does give us a better idea of how our students are doing relative to their peers. We can track and compare that growth over time. We can even predict how students will perform on accountability measures like STAR with a very high level of accuracy, and ultimately create great intervention programs for our students. So we do administer MAP in grades K through 8. However, the content areas are a little bit different for K2 versus 3-8. We do also administer a reading fluency assessment for all of our K2 students. And then that is something that we can do in the upper grades if students are struggling readers to help monitor progress and growth there. But this evening, we're really going to focus in on reading and math and science growth, which are administered across those levels with the exception of science, which we begin in grade 3. So MAP growth. I mentioned the norming. This is a great benefit of the program because it allows us to quickly and easily see how our students are doing relative to their peers across the nation. These norming samples are very, very large, and they were actually just renormed in 2020. The prior norming was completed in 2015. And so it's important to know as we move forward in looking at these comparisons that the norming that occurred happened prior to COVID. And so when we look at projected performance and projected growth, that is based on how students were doing during the pre-COVID times. And so with that norming, you'll see how students are expected to perform at the fall, winter, and spring administration by grade level. And those numbers that you see listed there under mean are the RIT score. So the mean or the middle of average RIT score for each content area. Then we would also have math, you can see there on the right, as well as science, which is not pictured. So just a very brief reminder for those of you that don't work in statistical analysis every day. The mean is considered to be the middle of average, so that 50th percentile. The MAP assessments are on a normal distribution, meaning that when they score and they design these norms, 68% of the population will fall one standard deviation above to one standard deviation below. So there is that range of what is considered to be average. So with this particular example, we're looking at a third grade student at the winter administration. This tells us that the national norm, again under pre-COVID times, is a RIT score of 193.9. Well, with a standard deviation of 16.14, we know that the average range would actually fall anywhere between 17.76 and 210.3. The understanding that in there, the middle of average is 193.9, upper average is going to be over 200. So that range helps us to really identify where students are falling relative to their peers. And you can see as well that over time, not only within that grade level, as a student progresses from the beginning to the end of the school year, those RIT scores increase, but from the early grades up as well. In addition to the achievement norms, MAP provides growth norms because we want to know just not how that student is doing in this snapshot today, but how they're growing over time. And so same idea here, we've got a mean RIT growth score as well as a standard deviation. So following along with that same example that we just used for the achievement norm, a third grade student in the area of reading from their fall to their winter administration is expected to grow a mean RIT score of 7.28 points. So any student that grew between 1.42 and 13.14 would be considered to have demonstrated average growth over that time frame. All right, you still with me? Mm-hmm. All right. So we're going to delve into our district level data, and then we will talk more about how we're using this information. I'm going to go relatively slowly on this first slide, specifically in the area of math, because this is very new information for you all to see, and it also is somewhat more complicated than it might have otherwise been if we were looking at a beginning to end of year growth of a single cohort. So the actual bars there, the blue bars across each of the grade levels from K to 8 listed below, indicate how much growth our students made from fall of 19, our very first ever baseline administration on the MAP assessment, to our fall of 2020 results. Now, again, this is not ideal in terms of data reporting because the cohort has changed with the grade level, but it also does give us a pretty good idea of how our students fared despite the adjustment in instructional model that was made mid-March in order to meet our learners' needs while in the at-home learning setting. So the bar indicates the actual mean growth for that particular grade level from fall to fall. And then the diamonds represent what MAP would project that growth to be based on, again, typical circumstances and where that initial baseline rate fell. So this tells us right away that despite the timing of school closures and at-home learning, our students continued to demonstrate growth from fall of 2019 to fall of 2020. It was not necessarily where we would like to see it in all areas, and you'll see that trend as we go through, as some areas are greater and some are less than others. But it does give us an understanding that there did continue to be growth and that our students didn't necessarily demonstrate the kind of regression that we're hearing reported, certainly from the state level, with the potential for a 5.9 month learning loss that was recently reported by TEA. Okay. So fall to fall. Now, we just administered our winter or our mid-year assessment in the 3 content areas. So we're going to start with mathematics across the grade levels to see in that snapshot of time, which occurred around the November-December time range. It was a 4-week window of administration. How did our students perform? So again, we're still looking at mean RIT scores. Our scores are in the red, and the blue are the mean normed scores. So the blue does not represent how nationally students actually performed in winter. It represents how they performed based on the norming tables. If we were to look at actuals, or have access to look at actuals, I should say, that might look very different, again, due to the impact of potential learning loss with COVID. So right away, you'll notice that our scores are overall not extremely different than those national scores. We've got a little bit of a lower rate of performance in that first and second grade level, but then over time, as a student's grade levels progress, we tend to see a wider gap between the national norm and our students' performance. So one more look that is a little bit different at the data in the area of mathematics, and that is how are our students doing right now this year from the beginning of school, fall administration, which we began in late August and completed in September. Are we seeing those students to learn and grow during that time frame? So similar to the first slide you saw, the bars are representing the mean RIT score point growth, and the the grade level norms projected growth above are indicating what is expected under normal circumstances. So in this lens, it looks a little bit different than what we saw in that year-over-year performance, where our younger grades did not necessarily demonstrate as much growth as we would normally expect. And then our upper grades did meet and even exceed, in some cases, those rates of growth. So I think it's very helpful to see this through these different lenses, because just looking at year-over-year growth, or just looking at growth from one administration to the next, or just looking at actual performance and one snapshot at a time only gives you one piece of the puzzle. And we really have to triangulate and look at it through all of these different lenses to determine where are there specific concerns and strengths and trends. And so we wanted to provide this layer of information for you all to better understand how our students are growing under current circumstances. So let's shift gears to reading. So same idea here. We are looking at fall 19 to fall 20. In the area of reading, we saw a more closely aligned actual growth relative to projected across the grade levels than we did in the area of mathematics. But again, we didn't quite get where we might have under normal circumstances. You might notice that there's not a diamond above kinder, and again, that is that hazard of not being able to report the same cohort year over year. So looking at the winter administration in the area of reading, compared to those national norms, our students in the lower grades did not quite hit the same mark that our national peers did under typical circumstances. However, in grades 3 and up, we exceeded those national mean norms across the board from grades 3 through 8. Looking at reading growth, not surprising given the data on the last particular slide that our early grades were not demonstrating as much growth as the upper grades. And again, we just want to really make sure that we acknowledge the fact that our students are continuing to grow, and we're going to be monitoring this very, very closely as things progress throughout the year. In the area of science, that administration begins in third grade, and so we don't have growth for those third grade students because they would not have taken it last year. But you can see we met and exceeded, with one exception where we got very close in the seventh grade, that growth from fall of 19 to fall of 20. In the area of science, we also exceeded those national norms in all of the grade levels assessed during the most recent winter administration. And then in the area of science from fall to winter, you can see those rates of growth in terms of RIT scores were not as great. I would also draw your attention to the axis there where the RIT growth is 5. And so sometimes those gaps look really wide, and sometimes it's related to the scaling of the charts. So really and truly, we're looking at 3 RIT points there in third grade. So it's important just to kind of keep an eye on those variables as we go through as well. So certainly as we look at those, there are things to celebrate. Ultimately, the fact that our students are continuing to learn and grow even at the beginning of the year, despite the school closures, are one. But there are also areas that we want to really make sure that we're responding to and working hard to monitor and adjust and promote growth for this next administration. And so we're going to look at some reports that I think will better illustrate how our campuses are using this data to inform instruction. So we'll start with class level reports. So this is an actual de-identified class level report for one of our classrooms at the elementary school level. And so right here in the top, you'll notice there were 19 students in this particular class. And so as a teacher, I can see that my class's mean RIT score was 216.2. And looking at how that compared to the district's mean RIT score, I can immediately see I was exceeding that district level and then also that norm or national norm grade level mean RIT of 204.5. I can also quickly see in my overall performance bar here, right there towards the middle of the screen, that my students were not normally distributed, right? I didn't have the majority of my students falling in the average range. In fact, I had 14 out of the 19 falling in high average to high, whereas 1 in low, 1 low average, and 2 average. Then it actually breaks that overall performance down into particular goal areas: numerical representations and relationships, computations and algebraic relationships, geometry measurement, and then data analysis and monetary transactions, so that I can see how those students are falling within particular goal areas. Now, this gives me a good idea if I have in the content, curriculum scope and sequence, I've covered maybe a lot on money so far this year. I would expect my students to perform a little better, because again, this is a national test, not a state level test, and certainly not a district level test that's aligned to the implementation of the curriculum. So those variables can play in. So this gives me some general overview of how my class did on that math assessment. But what's really helpful is when I know where those particular students fell. So this is an actual de-identified class where I can see in those different goal areas that I just mentioned how my students performed in the RIT ranges. So you can see across the top here, RIT ranges. And then I can quickly identify, gosh, I had 4 students that fell in a RIT range of 181 to 190 in the area of computations and algebraic relationships. Those students would probably be a great group to pull together for some remediation. So instantly, I've identified an area of need and which students have those needs at the classroom level. One of our administrators and teachers' favorite charts is the 4-quadrant growth and achievement chart. And so we'll start in the lower left quadrant, and you can see the small little green pluses on there. Those are indicative of students, and in the teachers' digital version of the software, they actually can mouse over and see which students those were, and then click the student and go directly into their specific results. So what's nice is I can quickly see which of my students were clustered in the low achievement, low growth category versus the high achievement, low growth, meaning they really did well compared to the national norms, but they didn't grow as much as we would expect them to grow. Then the top left quadrant being our low achievement, high growth, those perhaps struggling students that are showing a lot of growth. Maybe they're not where we want them to be with achievement yet, but we can really acknowledge and celebrate the fact that they are growing and moving in that direction. And then ultimately where we'd love for all of our students to be, the high achievement and high growth quadrant in the top right. So teachers can actually layer this information on digitally and see all of the different contents right at once, or just filter in and out depending on what they're looking at. Class reports for projected proficiency. I mentioned that the map can provide an estimate of STAR performance. This is particularly helpful when schools are really wanting to monitor student progress. We know with the current accountability system, there is a large emphasis on student growth, and we have seen a trend, certainly some of our campuses, where our high achievers are not demonstrating quite as much growth as they would need to be within that particular system to be considered to have grown adequately. And so this is a really useful tool that some of our principals have been using to identify, especially those students who really should be in the meets or masters category and are not quite hitting it. So again, back to that quadrant report, we can identify those kids who should be achieving greater levels of growth and provide interventions on the other end as well. Again, we can take that same data and break it down by individual students almost instantaneously with the reporting features. And so this is one component that's a useful tool for our campuses. Then at the individual student level, the online reporting system is very dynamic. And this is just a screenshot. And you can see in the top right now, it's highlighting one particular student's performance in the area of mathematics. You can quickly see their trend line over time with that gap, of course, in spring of 20 when we did not administer the MAP assessments. You can also see their most recent administration, both from the growth perspective and their achievement perspective right away. And then as a teacher, I can drill down into those instructional areas and really see specific skills that a student is ready to learn and things that they have mastered. This is a great tool for a teacher to use during a teacher conference as well with a parent to show a greater level of detail than what our parents do receive, which is the family report. And this is a much more concise version that provides an explanation of what MAP is, as well as how a student performed on their recent administration, again with those trend line charts over time, so that parents can really be involved in understanding how their students are doing. Additionally, for our families, there is a parent toolkit component of the NWEA or MAP website that is very helpful if our parents have questions about the MAP assessments. There's some videos on there, some really useful tools to better interpret those results. So as we wrap up this evening, I'd like to talk about some of our areas of glows and grows. You know, when we last when we last presented information about our first administration, we were really still learning, because it is quite a learning curve to administer an assessment like this on such a wide scale. But, you know, it really has gone well. We did administer both to our virtual and our on-site students during the fall, or that first administration of the year. We found the virtual administration to be not only extremely cumbersome, but challenging just in terms of having a teacher who was on site monitoring that student to take that assessment real time. And so we did require students to come in. We felt like that increased the validity of the assessment. We had our campuses set up some testing sites as well as testing site here. And that would also be comparable with what will be required of us in the spring as we move into required state testing. So as mentioned, we're very pleased that even though the growth has not been what it might have been otherwise, our students have continued to grow and push forward and show that they're continuing to learn under these circumstances. We are very pleased to see how much MAP is meeting our needs. We knew that we needed it. I think we just didn't know quite how much until we got in there and realized what it could really do for us. In addition to that achievement and progress monitoring, we are now using it for required dyslexia screening in grades K1, and it is also a component of our GT identification process. The data and reporting features do very much support instructional adjustments. Getting that information 3 times a year allows us to monitor and adjust. In fact, we adjusted our calendar for administration of MAP this year to do the winter administration prior to the winter break, so that we would come back and be able to hit the ground running instructionally in the spring, and then actually administer the third or the spring assessment in time to still get that data back and be able to continue to monitor and adjust before the end of the school year. And so we'll actually be doing that more like the April timeframe. Instructional decision-making is an important component of what we do every day, whether that's for students who are struggling through the response to intervention process, students with disabilities who are either served under an IEP with an ARD committee or a 504 committee. And so we've found that this has been a very helpful talking point to help design those plans. And then ultimately, we have received some really positive parent response that this is a much more comprehensive and informative measure for them to understand how their students are doing. Some areas that we have identified a need to continue to grow is, one, we'd like to really try to narrow those testing windows down from 4 weeks. If we could administer the entire assessment in, say, 3 weeks, that would provide additional instructional time between those windows and really, just free up time for instruction. Now we have adjusted in other ways to abandon other types of assessments in lieu of MAP, but right now the biggest constraint to narrowing those windows would be availability of devices for students to take those assessments in a timely manner. Our ongoing training is going to be an important part of keeping this going and the success of the program, especially around the area of accommodations. It's not quite as black and white as the guidance that we're provided for STAR, and so we need to make sure that we're being as consistent as possible there, as well as just onboarding our new teachers and making sure that they are well versed in not only the administration but the reporting features and how they can use that in their instructional practice. So with that, I know I've provided quite a bit of information, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Thank you for going through that. Obviously, lots of interesting information. And also, I'm glad to hear that you feel like it's a positive for the district, for the teachers, the students, the parents, because it sure looks like it. And I think for us to be able to, like you said, administration to look at the data. So again, it's a lot, and hopefully we'll have access to look at it more and look at some of the details. But correct, am I wrong to my perception of the growth, which I think is one of the, an important metric, are we actually, are students growing in their learning? The year to year didn't look that bad from fall to fall. But the fall to winter seem to have bigger gaps. And again, maybe some of that's on the scale, but do you have, is there an explanation for that potentially, or?
So I think it's important to understand when we take that winter snapshot and look at growth there, we actually had a narrower window of instructional time in between those assessments than what many other districts do between those windows. We had to start a little bit later because we were still working on getting devices out and just some of the interesting components of opening school in the age of COVID. And so I do think that is probably one part of why our growth looked a little bit different, is that earlier administration in the winter. So I think it's going to be important for us to really see how that affects us as we go through the next administration, because I anticipate we'll probably see much better rate of growth during our spring administration.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I know we had talked about a few problems with the original fall administration, possibly too. But so I was wondering if you looked at winter to winter then, because those would that have been more a little apples to apples comparison to see if we really, how far we were behind due to COVID?
Yeah, so I did run winter to winter and debated really what would make the most sense in terms of sharing the information. And I think what really gets confusing over winter to winter is we've got not only the school closure time when we were all at home learning, but then also the fall growth. And so I really tried to delineate that out so we could kind of see what the loss might have looked like coming back to school in the fall relative to what it was in the prior fall. Ultimately, it did not look drastically different, but again, looking through all of these different lenses is one of the great benefits of MAP and really helps us to piece the puzzle together rather than just a finite score in one moment of time.
Thank you.
Just kind of a random question that kind of piggyback on Ms. McAdams there. On that winter, that snapshot, when is that? When is that window? Is that at the end of the first semester, or is it the beginning of the second?
So districts do have some latitude in terms of when they set those windows. NWEA, the company who administers MAP, recommends at least 14 weeks of instruction, I believe, between those windows in order to really make sure that you're maximizing the learning. Now, they do adjust those norms based on the number of weeks of instruction a student has had. And so if you don't start your fall administration until 5 weeks in school, there's an adjustment relative to that first week. So we set our calendar up in the system so they're able to align that up with what week of instruction we're actually on in our district relative to others.
Did we see any statistical difference between on-campus students and virtual or at-home learning students as far as the growth?
So one of the challenges is that the way that the map data is in the system, I'm not able to disaggregate and show virtual versus on-site students. I will say anecdotally, our campus administrators felt like overall our virtual students performed higher at the fall administration, and there were some concerns that parents didn't fully understand the importance of it being a fully independent assessment. And so I think, as they look at those winter administrations, it will be interesting to see, if a student had learning loss, was that truly a learning loss between fall and winter, or was that an impact of fully being assessed independently in the winter?
So that could influence the data we see when we look at fall to winter.
It could. I don't know that the volume of students who were virtual are enough to totally shift means of the entire
much.
district, but certainly at the class level or even at the campus level, if there were large numbers of students at home, there could be some impact on that. In fact, we had some conversations around excluding results and ultimately have not excluded any fall virtual learner results from what you've seen this evening.
One other kind of question to point out, see if I'm interpreting this correctly. I noticed the expected growth on the norms it stood out to me. It's so much bigger for like K through 5. I mean, I guess we kind of know that, but it really stood out on that those are such expected big steps in learning, and it gets smaller and smaller as they get all. I'm interpreting that correctly?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That very much aligns with what we understand about child development, that in those early years we see much larger rates of learning. And while we're learning more detailed and technical things, later on, those huge gains are often made in the early grades.
We got to get it right in elementary.
Absolutely.
What it says to me, too.
If I heard you correctly, you said that right now the assessment's taking roughly 4 weeks, and you'd like to see that tighter, maybe 3 weeks, but we need
Ideally.
more devices.
Absolutely.
So after COVID, as the district, we've bought many devices. I mean, how many, is it because the devices are home with children, or is it we need to potentially look at more devices? What does that mean by if we had more devices?
So prior to COVID, we were already having conversations about our desire to enhance the number of devices to improve access in our classrooms and to really infuse technology more in the classroom experience day to day. Certainly at the beginning of the school year, the distribution of devices to our at-home learners did deplete our supply to some degree. Now, as those students have, many of them returned, those devices have come back to school with them. And as you all know, because you were very much involved with some of those purchases, we have infused even more. We are still awaiting our shipment of those that we purchased very early in the year because we were part of that cooperative purchase with Operation Connectivity, and unfortunately have not yet received those. We are, at this point, I'm looking at Mr. Hutchison, still expecting January, but I don't believe we have any new updates there. That's correct. As we move into some upcoming conversations that I know Ms. Strauss will share a little more with you later this evening, we very much would like to see, not just for the purpose of MAP administration, but for day-to-day access to instructional technology, our teachers have greater access to devices for our students.
Anything else?
Can you go back to the class report real quick? Sure, that go down one more.
Or that one.
There we go. So I think as we look overall at this, we got to remember that the norm values we're looking at are under normal circumstances versus what we have encountered. So there's some impact on that. While our students haven't grown as much as you would project, there's still growth considering our circumstances. But a real value to this, setting that aside, and Molly kind of referenced this on this particular slide, is the value this brings to our teachers. Because after each of these assessments, and some of our principals and campuses are doing, they're doing a wonderful job interpreting this data, because what you can do very quickly is find the students in a particular area that they're struggling and need intervention in. You can address that with targeted instruction with particular students and intervene sooner than later. So I think that's something we also have to be mindful of, is it provides our teacher useful data immediately so they can intervene sooner than later. Without MAP, you're reacting to as she mentioned, a postmortem assessment of some sort that's not necessarily norm referenced if it's locally developed or whatever it may be. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. This is a very powerful instrument and influences intervention and instruction, very focused intervention and instruction with focused group of students that show a need in a particular area. So a very powerful instrument, and we're fortunate to have it and to have gotten it really, even though we didn't get a full year's worth, but before COVID hit. It's kind of like Schoology, luckily we had it for a year or two in advance.
Absolutely.
Anything else? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Quite a bit of information. With that, our workshop will be concluded. We'll be adjourned and come back in about 20 minutes for a public hearing.